Hello, my name is Dwight Andrews, and I'm a saxophonist and professor of music theory and African American music at Emory University. On behalf of the Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, I'm thrilled to welcome you to a conversation with Mr. Archie Shepp. This is part of a larger music series of interviews with great jazz artists. And today we get a chance to talk with Mr. Shepp, saxophonist, composer, dramatist, writer, thinker, one of the great living icons of this music. I'm in Atlanta, and Mr. Shepp is joining us from Paris. And so this is an informal conversation, which I hope will be illuminating for all of you in the audience. And also, of course, for me as a musician, I'm honored to have a conversation with Mr. Shepp in person. Welcome, Mr. Shepp. Glad to see you today.
Thank you very much.
We are going to have just an informal conversation today, but I had so many different questions. I had to kind of edit myself to make sure that I could get the important points that you might want to share with us within our time frame. So, if we could, I'd like to begin our conversation by asking about your perspective on the present state of this music called jazz. We're part of a series called In the Tradition, but that tradition is very wide and very long. And so, I'd love to get your perspective on what it is that you would call jazz, or is that even the acceptable term for you? What does it describe, the jazz tradition? What does it mean to you, sir?
Well, I don't use the term jazz because I think that the origins of that word are in the French language. In fact, they have a word jazzer, which is to talk
Hmm.
better, lightly. They also have a term called jazz, which was the original spelling of jazz. Uh, so, to my way of thinking, all the indications is that jazz is a French
Hmm.
word, and it probably was became popular during the early part of the century when the French were really defining the culture of New
Hmm.
Orleans, and that's when the term jazz began to be used. Uh, so I prefer the term African American music,
Hmm.
and that's the way when I taught school. That was my way of describing music.
So, so,
Uh,
so African American music then encompasses many different uh, genres, forms, from your perspective.
yes, contemporary African American music, because of course there are the spirituals and the work songs and the gospel music, which is part of our oral tradition.
Mhm.
And so-called jazz music derives from the instrumental innovations that were made by African Americans,
Mhm.
uh,
So I was. Go ahead.
deriving
I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
deriving from the earlier period of spiritual, deriving from our oral
Mhm.
tradition. In other
Mhm.
words, our instrumental music is a fair imitation of the oral tradition, call and response, and things like that.
So, when was your first introduction to this music that we won't call jazz, but contemporary African American music? Where did you enter into this music? I know of your recording history since the early 1960s, but how were you first introduced to this tradition, this improvised music tradition?
Well, by my father, who was a banjo player, and he taught me a few chords on the banjo when I was a little boy, and I've been into this music ever
Wow.
since. And it's been into me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what age were you, I guess wanted to ask, when you moved to the saxophone?
Oh, I was about 15 when I picked up the saxophone. That was after I was taking lessons on the piano, and I had taken some lessons on the clarinet.
Hmm.
And I heard a young man in my high school, Norman Satchel,
Hmm.
play a solo of a song by Sonny Stitt, I
Hmm.
believe, called String in the Jug.
Hmm.
And I was hooked on the saxophone ever
Wow.
since.
Wow. And what type of saxophone is your primary tenor instrument? What make of it?
What
Yeah.
make it is it?
Uh,
It's a solo primarily, but recently I've been using a horn that's made by a man in Metz, Gilbert Bouton. I use his saxophone as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, of course, uh, Paris is the home of Selmer, Henri Selmer, I guess, and so there's a long legacy of those instruments, and especially the Selmer Mark Six is the one that I've been playing for forever. But I was curious because you have such a distinctive sound. And I know that the sound comes from the person, but I was just selfishly interested in knowing which instrument, which make of instrument you played. Let me ask you a question that's a bit aside. I didn't realize you had an interest or actually studied drama at Goddard College early on. And I don't associate, Archie Shepp with drama and theater. But what was the interest in theater, and what helped you to land with the music rather than on the stage or in film? What brought you to drama?
Well, I had a play produced off Broadway in the 1960s, originally titled The Communist, but the name was changed because we got a Rockefeller grant, and so it was changed to Junebug Graduates Tonight. It's been published in a book called The Black Drama Anthology, along with plays by Amiri Baraka and Douglas Turner
Hmm.
Ward, Lonnie Elder.
Hmm.
Uh, but the book is now out of print, though I did have a play produced off Broadway and published. I studied theater at Goddard, and I did some acting, and my thesis was actually a play. Uh, I was really undecided about going into music as a professional musician when I graduated, but I couldn't seem to land an acting role
Hmm.
because at that time there was a great deal of discrimination against black people in the theater, and there still is considerably. Uh, so I, I landed a job with Cecil Taylor. I was recommended to him by his bass player at the time, and Cecil did a recording. Uh, I forget the name of the recording, but it was my first record.
Hmm.
And then he later got a role uh, as a musician in the play The Connection by Jack Gelber. And so I figured someone was trying to tell me something. And I did get into the theater, but as a musician.
Uh-huh.
So from that point on, I concentrated on my musical career.
Interesting. And of course, people like Amiri Baraka, who are so interested in the music as well as the written word, um, I can see those connections. Of course, you know that we just lost Douglas Turner Ward just a few weeks ago here in New York.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. And I'm
Oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry to
I'm
hear that.
sorry if I'm the one to tell you that. Yeah. He passed away,
Yeah.
and I don't think they've had a formal memorial service yet, because of the pandemic. But he is in the spirit of everyone right now.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful
Yeah,
man.
great
Yeah.
dramatist, great mentor to many actors and writers. You,
Yes,
Yes.
indeed.
So you have had such an interesting career and interlaced spoken word with music uh, over the decades. So I'm curious about what you think of the present um, scene regarding this idea of spoken word. And I don't know how much you listen to any of the contemporary spoken word artists or so called hip hop artists that are integrating music and the spoken word in a quite a different form. But do you have any thoughts about that? The present spoken word?
Well, Chuck D recently recorded with me, well, a few years
Hmm.
ago now. He was here in Paris, and I got to meet him, and he very graciously did an impromptu rap to a blues I
Mm.
wrote, and recorded it on an album called Gemini. And I'm both uh, amused and inspired by some of the rappers I've heard, Snoop Dogg and Public Enemy, KRS
Hmm.
One. Uh, I think it's rap has evolved because uh, the younger people, this generation was denied some of the opportunities to play musical instruments. Uh, it used to be you could go to a pawn shop and get a clarinet for
Hmm.
$15 or a saxophone for 35, $40. You could pick up an instrument, and there were people in the neighborhood, in the community, who taught. Uh, Lessons were available to young people.
Hmm.
Today, that is much less frequent. Special programs that used to exist were eliminated by the Ronald Reagan
Hmm.
administration. When I was in school, you could take saxophone lessons, you could take borrow instruments and take them home for the weekend.
Right.
The school would provide those opportunities. But after Reagan, those opportunities were considerably limited, and young people didn't have access to actual musical instruments. And also with with the civil rights movement and the, the opportunities provided to African Americans professionals to teach school and so on, they eventually the the black professionals moved away from the city and the community, from the people, and they became less accessible
Hmm.
to young people. So today, we're faced with a situation where the younger generation is primarily uh, relegated to the oral tradition, and and they have ingeniously devised a new idiom, or popularized a new
Hmm.
idiom, rap, slam, and so on. Uh, I feel partly a part of that tradition because I started writing poetry and doing it to music backgrounds back in the
Hmm.
'60s. So, along with who are those guys?
Oh, the last poets.
The
Yeah,
Last
yeah.
Poets, yes.
Hmm.
Uh, So about the same time, I was also writing poetry to music, and so in a way, I'm a part of the new tradition of rap, and partly responsible
Yes,
for it.
right.
Yeah,
So interesting
yeah,
when we rewrite the history of hip hop and rap, Archie Shepp will be one of those founding fathers of that music. You know, it's interesting because a lot of young people don't even know of that tradition that goes much beyond Chuck D. That is going back to the Last Poets and Baraka's poetry and
yeah.
music. So it seems that in the midst of all of this creativity that young people are displaying by coming up with new inventive ways to uh, express themselves, uh, they've been cut off in some ways from a part of that history, cultural, political, and otherwise. And you've been describing it. Let me ask you, just in relation to that, you had a long teaching career here in the States, and I think you were at UMass for a long time. Is that right?
Yes, yes. I started teaching there in 1971, and I retired in 2002.
Wow. So you were there when Yusuf was there as well?
Yeah, Dr.
Yes, sir.
Latif, Martin Brown, Vishnu Wood,
Hmm.
they were all there.
Now, I'm just dying to ask. I knew Marion and I knew Yusuf, and what what made all of you end up in at UMass at the same time? What was going on there that made such a haven for these important creative voices? All of you being in that same geography.
Well, I was recruited from the University of Buffalo. I had been teaching there for a year and a half, and I was recruited by Dr. Ackland Lynch,
Hmm.
uh, who was a professor, I believe, at American University more recently. At that time, he was teaching at UMass, and he created a program uh, which included myself, Max Roach, Paul Carter Harrison, Nelson Stevens, the painter, uh, Diana, I forget her last name, she was a dancer. So it involved several disciplines. And he raised the money, he got a grant from the provost's office, Dr. Bromley, to bring us all there, and that's how I started teaching at UMass.
Interesting. It's fascinating because, of course, now I connect the dots when you name people like Paul Carter Harrison and Nelson Stevens, and I don't always associate them with that UMass era, but now it makes perfect sense because they also have a very large understanding of African American cultural expression, in which theater, dance, movement, history, culture, it's all in that large universe, and you're a part of that universe. That must have been a very rich period to be at that place with all those other spirits at the same time.
Oh, indeed it was. And Dr. Roland Wiggins was there as well, a music
Hmm.
theorist, theoretician. And he recruited Yusef, I believe, and Bill Cosby, and he was doing a study on the techniques of African American music and folk culture. Uh, uh, he was very much into computer
Hmm.
science, and so he was responsible for
Did you
several other
go ahead? I'm sorry.
opportunities.
Hmm.
He was responsible for recruiting several other artists in the university system.
Did you move to Europe after your retirement from UMass or after you finished at UMass, or how did the time back in Paris? What drew you then, and how long have you been in Paris as your base of operations?
Well, I've never lived in France. I live in Massachusetts, in fact. But people think that I'm based here because I'm so frequently in Europe and in France.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never really been based here. France has afforded me many opportunities that I wouldn't have had in the United States to be heard and to perform.
Mm-hmm.
And Europe, being here in Europe in general, has been quite an advantage.
Do you have an opinion? You know, people oftentimes say that that Europe is more supportive of just improvised African American music. Is that your perspective as well? You've just described many more opportunities in France and in Europe than you might have had in the States, and I assume that's still true.
Yeah, it's been true for quite a while, going back to Don Byas and Coleman Hawkins and Benny
Mhm.
Carter. Uh, uh, African American music has been highly rewarded and accepted by Europeans, particularly French, the French intellectuals, Charles Delaunay, Ernst Ansermet.
Mhm.
They were writing about people like Sidney Bechet way back in the
Right.
20s. And, so this music has been brought into the middle classes here. Uh, uh, you can hear it's been well integrated into the cultural norm. Uh, you can hear it on the news before the broadcasts. Frequently, they might have a Ben Webster solo or in the department stores. Um, it's been well integrated to the thoroughly integrated into the middle class norm uh, culture here,
That's
and so it's not just the working people who listen to it. It's widely enjoyed and appreciated.
so. It's. Do you think it's cultural, or I'm just trying to understand? France has long been a haven for many musicians, dancers, painters, writers. I'm just wondering, is that something in the culture? Is it in something in French culture, Parisian culture? Um, you've described that very long history that goes back to folks writing about at least jazz in the 1920s, and so many players were over there, and some stayed. But is it cultural, or what do you think it is that makes uh, that culture so embracing of this improvised music and African American artists?
Well, they have their own tradition, the classic music tradition, which is uh, widely appreciated here, and so they're not uptight about uh, admitting another culture into their, their sphere of interest. Uh, Chopin was here in France, and Rachmaninoff and Kurt Weill in Germany.
Mhm.
They have a tradition of classical creations, poetry, music, dance, that allows them to permit other people, other forms of music to enter into their sphere of interest.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
so they're not uptight about black music being somehow contrary to whatever they have created. In the United States, I think uh, white culture is fairly limited by comparison. I mean, Aaron Copland, Leonard
Mhm.
Bernstein, and they are profoundly influenced by African American music
Right.
too. So that uh, the, the 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 sweep of their influence, of their interest, is somehow limited, and really some they feel threatened by the innovations that African Americans have made and inroads into their culture,
Mhm.
into American culture, because we basically we symbolize what is American
Yes.
culture: jazz,
Mhm.
hip hop.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's all been created by, and before that, the folklore of Gorimas,
Mhm.
uh, 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 the American culture is derives partly
Um, yeah.
from
Yeah.
black
Yeah.
people, from
Mhm.
going back to St. Louis blues, W.C. Handy, and uh, the Maple Leaf Rag. That was the first popular music in America was ragtime,
Right.
and it was created by an American African Americans.
Um,
You know.
so we look forward to the time when there will be a historical reckoning with the contributions of African Americans to what it means to be American. But just given what you said, I'm curious of how you see this present moment in America. You know, people have described it as a time of racial reckoning and the issues of social justice, which have come, front and center of so many aspects of our experience. Right now, the George Floyd trial is going on in Minnesota. I'm curious how you see this present moment of, if not racial reckoning, the issues of social justice, and what do you think the role of the artist is in this present moment?
Well, um, we, uh, we 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 could play a profound role, but I don't think that black artists are really meeting the challenge, especially in African American music. Uh, uh, Maybe more, we can see more attention being paid by the rappers, the Public Enemy and KRS-One and groups like this, than the instrumental musicians. Uh, Prior to the 60s, uh, we had Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes, and African American culture was feted, was uh, appreciated by the African American musicians. But more lately, the younger musicians have not really use their platform, their forum to, to 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 argue for their rights and for justice. Uh,
Mhm.
I think they're content to play it safe and to be on the sidelines rather than to get into the mix. And because uh, music can play a vital role in expressing our frustrations, our aspirations, our hopes. Uh, Even the titles of songs. Duke wrote this album, My People. He composed the music for, and named the album My
Mhm.
People. Uh, Comes Sunday, which celebrates the Negro spiritual. Uh, a lot of that's gone from the contemporary performance of black musicians, and it should be revived because uh, it indicates our participation, our deep interest in the struggle and the liberation of our people.
Just listening to you, my heart of hearts wants to know how can the wisdom of Archie Shepp and your very, very contemporary understanding of our culture, how can we connect, Archie, your voice with some of the younger musicians, perhaps the next generation that perhaps has not risen to the challenge, but which you've acknowledged, you have such a great platform. How do we connect our generations around these issues of creativity and courage to step up to the plate?
Well, it's not easy because um, the success of many of the younger musicians has made them not so willing to get into the mix to participate in controversial uh,
Mm.
situations. And when we talk about race and the liberation of black people, that's a controversial issue. Uh, so it's really on the younger generation to 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 reach out themselves
Mhm.
because much has changed since I started to play music. There are opportunities, uh, enormous opportunities for younger people, and they're beginning to make money, and there is a temptation to lay out of the struggle and
Mhm.
to avoid
Avoid controversy.
participation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, listen,
yeah.
Mr. Shep, I am deeply in your debt for your wisdom, for your contributions to the music, for your voice. We have almost run out of our time, but I just wanted to, on behalf of the Mayor's Office of the Bureau of Cultural Affairs, I want to thank you for your time and for your candor and for your leadership. You are a great, important spirit, and I'm just honored to have had this few moments with you. Hopefully we can continue this conversation in some setting or another because I think it's an important conversation to have. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon.
I hope to see you
Yes.
soon. Thank you very
Très bien,
much.
merci.
Eh oui, merci. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
À bientôt.
À bientôt.